I like that a lot. Just try to keep up. Let's go. Since they're going crazy anyways, why not just send insane people in the first place and save them the trouble? Said Michel Duval. He was only half joking. His position throughout had been that the criteria for selection constituted a mind-boggling collection of double binds. His fellow psychologist stared at him. "Can you suggest any specific changes?" asked the chairman. Charles York. "Perhaps we should all go to Antarctica with them and observe them in this first period of time together. It would teach us a lot." "But our presence would be inhibitory. I think just one of us will be enough. Just one." So they sent Michel Duval. He joined 150-odd finalists at McMurdo Station. The initial meeting resembled any other international scientific conference, familiar to them all through their various disciplines. But there was a difference. This was the continuation of a selection process that had lasted for years and would last another. And those selected would go to Mars. So they lived in Antarctica for over a year together, familiarizing themselves with the shelters and equipment that were already landing on Mars in robot vehicles, familiarizing themselves with a landscape that was almost as cold and harsh as Mars itself, familiarizing themselves with each other. If you know what I mean. They lived in a cluster of habitats located in Wright Valley, the largest of Antarctica's dry valleys. They ran a biosphere farm, and then they settled into the habitats through a dark austral winter and studied secondary or tertiary professions, or ran through simulations of the various tasks they would be performing on the spaceship Ares, or later on the Red Planet itself. And always, always aware that they were being watched, evaluated, judged. They were by no means all astronauts or cosmonauts, although there were a dozen or so of each, with many more up north clamoring to be included. But the majority of the colonists would have to have their expertise in areas that would come into play after landfall. Medical skills, computer skills, robotics, systems design, architecture, geology, biosphere design, genetic engineering, biology, and also every sort of engineering and construction expertise of several kinds. Those who had made it to Antarctica were an impressive group of experts in the relevant sciences and professions, and they spent a good bit of their time cross-training to become impressive in secondary and tertiary fields as well. And all their activity took place under the constant pressure of observation, evaluation, judgment. It was necessarily a stressful procedure. That was part of the test. Michel Duval felt that this was a mistake, as it tended to ingrain reticence and distrust in the colonists, preventing the very compatibility that the selection committee was supposedly seeking. One of the many double binds, in fact. The candidates themselves were quiet about that aspect of things, and he didn't blame them. There wasn't any better strategy to take. That was a double bind for you. It ensured silence. They could not afford to offend anyone or complain too much. They could not risk withdrawing too far. They could not make enemies. So they went on, being brilliant and accomplished enough to stand out, but normal enough to get along. They were old enough to have learned a great deal, but young enough to endure the physical rigors of the work. They were driven enough to excel, but relaxed enough to socialize. And they were crazy enough to want to leave Earth forever, but sane enough to disguise this fundamental madness. In fact, to defend it as pure rationality, scientific curiosity, or something of the sort. That seemed to be the only acceptable reason for wanting to go. And so naturally, they claimed to be the most scientifically curious people in history. But of course, there had to be more to it than that. They had to be alienated somehow. Alienated and solitary enough not to care about leaving everyone they had known behind forever. And yet, still connected and social enough to get along with all their new acquaintances in Wright Valley, with every member of the tiny village that the colony would become. Oh, the double binds were endless. They were to be both extraordinary and extraordinary at one and the same time. An impossible task, and yet a task that was an obstacle to their heart's greatest desire, making it the very stuff of anxiety, fear, resentment, rage, conquering all those stresses. But that too was part of the test. Mikkel could not help but observe with great interest. Some failed, cracked in one way or another. An American thermal engineer became increasingly withdrawn, then destroyed several of their rovers and had to be forcibly restrained and removed. A Russian pair became lovers, and then had a falling out so violent that they couldn't stand the sight of each other, and had to both be dropped. This melodrama illustrated the dangers of romance gone awry, and made the rest of them very cautious in this regard. Relationships still developed, but by the time they left Antarctica, This melodrama illustrated the dangers of romance gone awry and made the rest of them very cautious in this regard. Relationships still developed, and by the time they left Antarctica, they had 3 marriages, and these lucky 6 could consider themselves in some sense safe. But most of them were so focused on getting to Mars that they put these parts of their lives on hold, and if anything, conducted discreet friendships. In some cases, hidden from almost everyone. In other cases, merely kept out of view of the selection committees. And Mikkel knew that he was only seeing the tip of the iceberg. He knew that critical things were happening in Antarctica, out of his sight. Relationships were having their beginnings, and sometimes the beginning of a relationship determines how the rest will go. In the brief hours of daylight, one of them might leave the camp and hike out to Lookout Point, and another follow. And what happened out there might leave its mark forever. But Mikkel would never know. And then they left Antarctica, and the team was chosen. There were 50 men and 50 women, 35 Americans, 35 Russians, and 30 miscellaneous international affiliates. 15 invited by each of the two big partners. Keeping such perfect symmetries had been difficult, but the selection committees had persevered. The lucky ones flew to Cape Canaveral, or Baikonur, to ascend to orbit. At this point, they both knew each other very well and did not know each other at all. They were a team, Mikkel thought, with established friendships and a number of group ceremonies, rituals, habits, and tendencies. And among those tendencies was an instinct to hide, to play a role and disguise their real selves. Perhaps this was simply the definition of village life, of social life. But it seemed to Mikkel that it was worse than that. No one had ever before had to compete strenuously to join a village. And the resulting radical division between public life and private life was new and strange. Ingrained in them now was a certain competitive undercurrent, a constant subtle feeling that they were each alone, and that in the case of trouble, they were liable to be abandoned by the rest and yanked out of the group. The selection committee had thus created some of the very problems it had hoped to prevent. Some of them were aware of this, and naturally they took care to include among the colonists the most qualified psychiatrist they could think of. So they sent Mikkel Duval. And we'll take a small break there.